for our investors, when they think about risk, especially early stage risk, if we're talking about two ventures that have equal risk and one is offering debt and one is offering equity, and we can talk about the impact profiles of those two companies. If you're doing the math as an investor, you're going, man, why wouldn't I go with the equity check that can produce 50 to 100x maybe, if I'm taking the same risk as what's going to give me 8% a year?
Welcome to the Feast Over Famine podcast. On this podcast, we're navigating the tension that we find where mission and profit collide. We're talking to CEOs, founders, executive directors, impact investors, and all of what we've identified as the global ecosystem of the social enterprise, business for transformation, business as mission landscape. We're talking to them about the obstacles they face, the strategic challenges they've been through, how they're funded, how they were started, and everything that's happened in between. We are trying to share their story in a way that's impactful to help us all to grow the social enterprise space for the better. Enjoy this week's episode with your host, Ryan Mahaffey.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Feast Over Famine podcast. Really excited. You guys are here listening this week and super stoked to have Patrick Farrell on with me. So Patrick's someone I met in the last couple of years who is really involved in the impact investing world out of DC. We've had so many great conversations. We've passed referrals back and forth. We've talked about different organizations doing capital raises and really wrestled with some cool topics. And so I'm really excited to have Patrick on and talk about the work he's doing, his entrepreneur and investor community he's cultivating, and just some of his thoughts on what he's seen in this space and where we think it's going to go. So Patrick, thanks for being on, man. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, Ryan, it feels like this is a long time coming. Psyched to jump in with you.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So let's jump in. Give me the 30. So Potomac Angel Capital, that's your I'm going to call it an investor network, and you can correct me on how you want to phrase it, but give me a quick 60 second snapshot on that. And then just so people kind of know what that is, and then we'll go into kind of your background and stuff from there.
Yeah, so Potomac Angel Capital is really a traditional angel network here based out of DC that we started with a small group of angels who were really interested in using their capital for impact and financial gain. So what does it look like to do both and have a community here locally that is focused on that? And so we started that in January of this past year, have done about 5 investments to date. So we've been small, but we've been very active, deployed over $1 million of capital into companies across a bunch of different industries and a bunch of different geographies.
And to be clear, we're going to go off the deep end on some of this stuff, but you guys are not a fund necessarily. So when you say we've deployed a certain amount of capital, that's saying, hey, the network sees this deal and individuals are saying they're going to invest X amount. And as a result of that, you guys have deployed over $1 million of capital. Is that, am I articulating that right?
Great clarifying point. So we function like any traditional angel network, which is really where we facilitate the deal flow and the diligence for our members, but our members are making all of the decisions along the way. So as you put it, it's really our angels who are deploying their personal capital. We effectively are like an investment club. We charge an annual fee for them to be a part of the network, but we're not taking a percent of a cut on deal flow. We don't have upside and interest carry. We don't invest on behalf of our investors. We're basically just facilitating the process for them.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. And doing it that way, like, can have financial upside for the founder of a network like that, but different than maybe a broker dealer and stuff. And so I want to get into the kind of your like career transition to want to do this and the impact that it can have. But let's talk a little bit about your background and career background, how you kind of got to this point so far.
Yeah, sure. So I think where I'll pick up is in 2016. So I had been working for Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a local government contracting firm, doing some management consulting for a couple of years. And then I joined a startup here locally called Nehemiah Security. It was a cybersecurity organization that was focused on cyber risk quantification. So it's really niche, sort of almost geeky sector of cybersecurity that we were going after.
Awesome.
And I had 2 roles there. One was corporate development, and the other was operations. So we had a growth by acquisition strategy and a wealthy family office that was funding that. And so we did a couple of acquisitions to kind of start building the firm. and then obviously had to integrate those and operationalize them moving forward. And so I was kind of led the diligence and ran point on a lot of those acquisitions, which gave me really the deal making bug, the valuations, dollars, looking through agreements, things like that, and exposure to what a very deep diligence process looks like. As an M&A, you're literally checking everything. And so that was a really cool experience and really got me exposure, and I found a lot of interest there. And then on the operations side, once we had made those acquisitions, we had to kind of grow and scale the business. Like we actually had to go, sell some product, get some customers, hire some employees. And so I was effectively, really in like a COO or a chief of staff type role there. Anything from recruiting to cross-departmental operations. They even kind of trained me how to do contracts. And so I was like looking through contracts and editing and working with our lawyers on that front. So I got like a mini JD during my time there. And so that gave me exposure to the deal making bug.
And so I think that's an interesting term. The deal making bug that you keep throwing out there. It's real. It's like when you hit a point in your career, if you're interested in that, or that's your career path, and you start to, I remember the point I was like, oh, why do I care about my salary? There's so much more of like evaluation, and then the sale and acquisition, and you start to open up to this whole other world of how all that stuff works. And then you're like, oh, there's some due diligence here, and here's how we're looking at it. It's just like a total zooming out of the picture in a really cool way. And you can't really go back from that. Like, once that clicked for me, I was like, oh, all right, well, this is the path I'm on now. So I don't like some of the things that I thought mattered didn't matter. And so it's an interesting term you're throwing out there of like deal making bug. Cause when you get it, it's like really, really interesting.
I think you're right. It also might be like one of those terms that really describes entrepreneurship. Like all of a sudden you get this $50,000 view, 50,000 foot view. And you're like, oh my God, there's a lot more going on in this business and a lot more things I can get my hands in. And it's exciting. It's risky all at the same time. And that was definitely what Nehemiah had exposed me to at the time, was just like the entrepreneurship side, deal making side, all of that, that really started changing my career trajectory moving forward.
Yeah. Awesome. So awesome career path to then, like, and then what was stirring in you to say, I mean, it sounds like that's a great career path. So like you could have stayed with them for a while. You could have kept doing that, kept growing, built an awesome company. But at some point you made the transition and said, hey, I'm going to go start this angel network. What was happening in you and what was going on to kind of push you to do that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll try to make this as a short story, but it's a long story short. So that business, Nehemiah's career, we actually ended up having an exit in August 2020, sold to a larger cybersecurity company called Threat Connect, who's actually based here locally in the DC area. So I had the privilege and the blessing of being able to see a venture from beginning to end. So from pre-revenue all the way through an exit.
Yeah,
which,
cool.
There are folks out there who don't get to see that in their lifetime, let alone in their 20s. So for me, that was like just a huge experience. And when we exited the business, obviously we were in the middle of a global pandemic. I had a decent financial situation, single, had been sitting on my couch for a long time. And I just was like, right now is a really good time to take a risk. And so through prayer and with like friends and family, I was like, here we go. I'm just going to jump out in the deep end. And I really started by consulting with early stage entrepreneurs, very similar to what you do at FISA or Famine. What does it look like to tell a story to investors that is attractive? How do we put together a pitch deck and a financial model that, and how do we kind of go out and do that? And I did that really with a focus on impact, mainly because I believe that like for-profit businesses that have sustainable models and are doing something good for the world are going to be the future of how we sort of restore and redeem what's been broken. And so with that conviction really coming from my faith and from just kind of where the world was at that point in time, I moved forward in that way. And what I realized in the process is that I think I would be better served creating a community of investors who are going to come alongside those entrepreneurs and make those investments. And then on the side, I could still do some of that consulting, but I was going to leave that more up to you and kind of take a different path. And so I had a group of angels here in DC that I had really good relationships with, whether from Nehemiah or before, just working relationships, or others who I had met as I was consulting with early stage entrepreneurs. And we started to start Potomac Angel Capital alongside my business partner Mike Grubbs, who's another entrepreneur here locally. And so that's kind of how it came together. Honestly, it was a process for sure, but just kind of trying to figure out where we wanted to go. As you know, kind of monetizing early stage entrepreneurs, like trying to do that in a way that's like honoring to them, knowing that they don't have a lot of money, and also making sure that I could pay the bills. That's a tough balance and a tough tension. And we found like investors obviously have capital and are able to kind of sustain the work that I do, which has been really a blessing for me as well. Is that a good overview?
Yeah,
that's bounce around there, but
that's super helpful. No, it's really helpful. And there's a few things you said in there that I think they're interesting. One being like what it means to restore and redeem what's been broken, and how the business community can do that. And so I think, for you, you're talking about the for-profit startup community doing that. Give me some examples of like, as you envision what that can look like. And we talk about it all the time on this podcast, different ways, but as you envision, like if you're sitting 5 years from now and Potomac Angel Capital's done a good job, how have some of those companies like redeemed and restored what's been broken in your mind? Like what would be some tactical, tangible versions of that?
Yeah. Well, I think what's weird is where when we talk about impact, a lot of times we go into like the mechanisms of doing so, or how, what that looks like in terms of KPIs, how we measure this impact, and all that's really important. What's interesting is where my mind first went is how would we show that it's been successful? Well, we want to see that company was either profitable, meaning that they are sustaining that impact via their business operations, or that they've had an exit, whether it's public or private, that has provided those financial returns to investors. So coming from the investor side, one of our convictions is we're prioritizing impact alongside financial gain. If there's not a sustainable model for impact, then you're not going to see that sustained over time in a more efficient way. And so I think it's important to highlight that first. So like first thing that we'd see as success is like these companies surviving, thriving financially, potentially even having exited. That provides those returns to our investors and shows that we've done a good job of sustaining that impact. Secondly, and I think more to what your question was, how would we see some of these things playing out? Well, I think it really comes down to the mission of the company. So what does it look like to clearly articulate and then accomplish that mission in a way that prioritizes that mission? And so what we find a lot is that, and we can talk about this more, but some of the categories for impact tend to be a little bit nebulous, and you can have an impact or really accomplish a mission, even if you're not a typical ESG type company. And so one of the examples I like to give is like, if you're creating a doorknob and that doorknob is the like best doorknob in the entire world, and people are getting out of doors in a really fast and efficient way, as dumb as that might sound, like that is having an impact on the world that's positive. And so I think what for us would be really important is to see those missions really encapsulated and really well thought out and well executed. And that can look different depending on what company it is. Obviously, I can give a couple examples of companies we've invested in, how that would look, but just at a high level, I feel like that might be a decent overview.
Yeah. And in a lot of that, if the mission is there and it's making the door, for example, the doorknobs better, I mean, that's going to have an impact on the world. But it also sounds to me like part of your guys' perspective is let's like internal thriving. So we want the employees and the founders and the investors to like thrive financially. And, so you're looking at them thriving more than a company saying, hey, Patagonia saying, hey, we're going to give 30% of our money away to environmental research kind of stuff for supporting the environment. Great. But those are more like external metrics. And now the companies you guys are investing are obviously going to have those, but I think it's a cool qualifier that you guys are focusing really primarily on like, let's have a successful company, because from a successful, financially sustainable company comes all these other potential impact things as a result of just like a healthy environment in that sense, which I think is cool. The other part that I think is interesting, and we might circle back to ESG here in a little bit, because I think it's an interesting conversation, but the other thing is how you mentor and lead investors through that process. So that's the other part I hear you talking about too. You kind of have two sides. Like you want to see the founders thriving. You want everyone to get the returns. You want to see all that stuff, have healthy companies, but investors might be new to this whole thing. They might not be used to being an angel investor. And so how do they come alongside a company? What's a healthy perspective? What are they wrestling with? And how are you kind of mentoring and guiding them in that? Talk to me about that piece, because I know it's important to you even in the DC metro area, but let's stay big picture first. Like, what does that investor journey look like? And how are you guys trying to do things differently to serve them in this process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think for our investors, everybody's somewhere on that journey or that spectrum as to not only how they think about impact, but also how you might think about angel investing. So what we're finding is there's a lot of folks who are like really interested in, or probably entrepreneurial in nature. Like they have a background in entrepreneurship. They've started companies, they sold companies, and they're like, hey, I really am passionate about this, but I've never done an investment, or we never did an acquisition, or you know what I mean? Like there's a gap practically, and then there's a gap on impact. I think for us, what we're learning, which we're just very early in the process, is it's really about doing it together. So like bringing people alongside us, like when we're doing diligence on a company, here's how we think about it. Here's our processes. Yeah. Jump on some of these calls with us, jump on calls with the entrepreneur, like learn how we think about this. And then also we're starting to lean into more and more, I would say, stories and thought leadership. And what I mean by that is at our last pitch meeting, we had one of our investors just like give some of his background and his story and like how he thinks about things. And that was a huge hit just because it was not only personal. So like you're getting to know each other better. So building community, but also just being able to gain his insights, maybe give some people like light bulb moments as to like, oh, here's something I could try out, or here's how I can move forward. Frankly, a lot of the literature, the content on angel investing or investing in general is mostly on the practical side. So how do you think about valuations? What's a term sheet? Like what, all this sort of stuff, which is really valuable. And a lot of our angels have gotten a lot out of some of that. What's really missing is how do we think about impact? As an investor, what am I interested in? Or how do I construct a portfolio? Or what does it mean? Like what should I focus on? And I think that's where not only we're pretty early, but this like space in general and how people are talking about this is really early. And it's a huge gap. And so I wouldn't say that we've really figured that out, but we're working towards what does it look like to help walk with investors on that journey so that they would know exactly what they've been called to invest in, and how to steward their money in a way that provides impact and provides them fulfillment and meaning.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing with all that, like we're seeing a revival in the angel kind of investment space where it isn't all about money. You know, for a long time, it was like churn and burn, quantity over quality. Let's get as many angels in. Let's get as much money in. You just look at like just the traditional Silicon Valley, funds and what's out there and just go as much as possible. It's a numbers game. And a shift is happening to say like, let's think a little more intentionally about that. Maybe it isn't 1 out of 100 deals do well. Maybe it's 1 out of 10 because we actually we come alongside them because it's not about just minimal effort for maximum gain and playing the risk and all that. And so I think that yearning and like that cultural yearning is there in that investor space. And so I think it's really good because hopefully you're kind of a one to many of that. So you start having these conversations and then they go out and talk to someone else, and over a 10 to 20 year period, or hopefully less, like I hope that changes where every angel investor is saying, hey, we want to serve the founder. We want to do due diligence differently. We want to do all these things. And so I think it's a cool shift that's happening. I think you guys are kind of on the ground stages of that. And that's a little bit of a transition then into the DC metro area specifically. So that's where you're at. Last time we were talking, I thought it was interesting because I said, hey, like there's funds that focus, and you're not a fund, but there's funds and angel networks and investor networks that focus on a specific geographical area or not. And you guys aren't necessarily totally specific on one of those things, but you have a heart for DC and a lot. That's obviously Potomac Angel Capital, even in your name and stuff. What does it look like for the potential investor community of DC and the impact you want to have there? Because I think your heart, you have like an even deeper heart level for kind of the mentorship and what that looks like for the DC community. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'd be remiss to not say that, like, I think really we've been talking a lot about impact, but a lot of the differentiator in any early stage company is the entrepreneur. I think you'd probably agree with that, like,
Yep.
we're talking about whether something at a very early stage has the potential to be successful. The number one factor in that is the entrepreneur. And I think we know just via statistics that, like, entrepreneurs are super lonely, super high stress, super high rate of burnout, super high rate of relational fray. So whether it's with their spouse or their kids or their friends, like, it is entrepreneurship is incredibly hard. And so what we like to do is we want to come alongside those entrepreneurs as investors and help them walk through their journey together. A lot of our investors have experience, whether it's business practical or relational, spiritual, if that's something that matches up with the entrepreneur. Like, there are a lot of ways in which experienced investors can come alongside entrepreneurs and really help them be successful. And so I think that that's a huge goal of ours. I think for us in DC, we have context matters. We have a super unique city in that we have a high rate of gentrification that's happened throughout the city. We have very diverse populations that have been pushed out. We have a lot of transplants. So people who come here, work for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then leave. We have a high amount of young folks. We really focus on a few different industries, like government contracting, some consulting, a little bit of tech, but like mostly government and politics. And so we have this, like, kind of unique build. And then obviously, as I mentioned, the political scene, like, you can feel it here in DC when you're around. Like, there's that is truly the heart and the center of the city. And so, like, when we think about all of those dynamics, it's not your typical Austin or San Francisco where you have, like, a ton of entrepreneurs in the tech scene that's bubbling and growing and sort of like this really, really deep community. We don't have as many entrepreneurs here as there are in other places.
And I'll say to that really quick, just a point. Like, I think government contracts stifle entrepreneurship. Like for me, anytime, like, if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting something, you're either going after government stuff and you're like, have figured out the red tape and that's like the kind of contracts you want, or you're like, man, I don't have time for a 3-year sales cycle while this grant comes in. And then I need to front, $200,000 for my employees while there's a net 60 and then it gets pushed back kind of, and it's not to hate on the government a ton, but it's just like a slow moving behemoth. And so I think just the part of what you're saying, what I've seen is, like, the style of entrepreneurship there is a little bit different than some of those other cities where it's like fast moving, you can get some quick wins, you move and shake and do this kind of stuff. It is different in that, which is really interesting. So sorry to cut you off. I just want to throw that in. Like, I've seen some of that, and I think it's an interesting piece.
Yeah. And so that definitely contributes to the scene, right? Like, if you're in government contracting, entrepreneurship, you've probably gotten there in a different way, or you started somewhere, like you won a contract somehow, or you spun off from one of these big government contractors and started your own thing, or maybe you're a veteran, minority owner. And so, like, you got a small contract and built from there. It's just a little bit of a different scene. But from that perspective, having kind of limited entrepreneurs, the DC area also geographically is, like, pretty spread out in terms of, like, there's like 1 million people in the district, but then there's 10 million people, I'm just using round numbers, in the suburbs, like, spread throughout Maryland and Virginia. And so, if anyone who lives here in DC knows, like, getting around the Beltway can be a bit of a hassle with traffic and just being spread out and stuff. And so what we found is that, like, angel investors also tend to be spread out. So, like, there's a couple really good ones in Virginia that all the investors live pretty much within a couple of zip codes of each other. And so what we wanted to do is especially bring together community. And coming at this from a faith perspective, we were trying to bring together a lot of folks who kind of share like-mindedness, not necessarily Christian, but who are coming together from that rootedness. And so that those are folks that are all over the district. And so anyways, to answer your question, kind of two
interesting.
Shorten it down. One, our heart for the city. we'd love to create a bigger community of thriving here in DC that's connecting more and more entrepreneurs. There's some organizations doing it well, but we feel like there's still a gap where there's plenty of room for more folks to come alongside entrepreneurs, investors, and especially folks who are business professionals, business executives who are like looking for community, are looking for a way to get into entrepreneurship, or looking at bad ideas around with people. We think there's a gap there that we can help fill. And then obviously on the investor side, just kind of bringing together folks in person, in community together from around the DC area into one place to really bless the world through our investments. So that's a very high level how we think about it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think the cultures of certain cities and regions, and how, like, if you were to drop the same exact thing you're doing into Denver, how different it would have to be versus, I think that's super interesting. So thanks for diving into that a little bit. Even just geographically thinking, like how long it takes to get from one area to the other. And, how is that like Denver, you can get from one side to the other pretty quick. You do get little pockets, but like, I don't see it as like these little pockets the same way with Colorado. It's kind of one central community, but I do know there's certain areas where it's like, you live in one side of the city and it's like a totally different world than the opposite side, which is really interesting. So one of the things you and I have wrestled with quite a bit, one thing I wanted to say to that and kind of get your, like, the investor founder relationship you're talking about is like a very intimate relationship. And it's almost like a marriage that you're getting into, and it could go really bad. It could go really well, but there needs some like pre-marriage counseling. And so in some ways I'm kind of like, yeah, you guys are a little bit doing like the pre-marriage counseling and then marriage counseling in some ways, like, hey, let's prepare each side of this for like how to have a healthy relationship here. Because when the investor founder relationship is really, really dialed in and really fruitful and really mutually beneficial and servant hearted, that is beautiful to see, and it thrives and everybody is crushing it. When one side is worried about the risk more than the other, and then the communication's off, and all of a sudden it starts to go kind of sideways, and you get into these like legal battles and all sorts of crazy stuff that happens. And so I think like the service of, hey, like, let's do this part well and connect, like what you've been talking about is really needed, particularly in like in our, like you were saying, I think my hope is in the faith-based version of that. There's kind of a moral kind of baseline that both people are operating on, but I just think culturally we need that. And so as you guys are talking to the faith-based or non-faith-based world, either to really put that in place is really important. So yeah, just even that's like been a clarification for me of how you guys are entering into it in this conversation, which is maybe you like that or don't.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you put it that way. One of our core values that we started with was covenant. So partnering with each other in mutually sacrificial relationship for impact. That's kind of how we define it. Yeah. Which obviously we're not saying it's as deeply covenantal as like a marriage relationship. You can have different levels of covenant. I'm sure we can get into that, but people got scared of that term, and they were like, "Whoa, covenant, that's crazy." So we had actually changed it to commitment. We left the definition the same, just commitment.
Oh, interesting.
So both sides were kind of scared of that, using it that way.
Yeah.
But the illustration that you gave is very true. Like we're looking mutually for like, hey, an investor wants to be honored in their personhood and like for who they are, and wants to be seen as somebody who can be a resource to the company. And an entrepreneur also is probably looking for more than just capital, and is not looking for somebody who's going to like rule over them and tell them what to do and like be a pain in their butt when things happen. And so we're talking about some sort of mutual commitment. And that doesn't mean that it's a commitment that like has to continue on forever. When it's like, hey, we're getting into business together here, and an investor relationship, it's their own personal capital usually that's just on the line, which is, I think sometimes it could be helpful for entrepreneurs to understand that, like when they're raising money, that's what they're asking for. It's like somebody else's hard-earned dollars. And so that mutuality, I think you nailed it. It's really, really important, and trying to foster that and really evaluate whether both sides are interested in that at all. I know I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole here, but like sometimes we find entrepreneurs who are great and are running a business that's awesome, but they're not really looking for that. They're just kind of like, I've got that in my life, or I don't really need that right now. I just need the capital. And that's not really a fit. But also if the investor is not willing partner as well, and really isn't passionate about the mission or doesn't have a personal relationship with the entrepreneur, that could be a mismatch also.
Yeah.
So we try to snuff that out when we're evaluating opportunities.
Yeah, that doesn't mean there's not a place for it, but it means there's not a place for it in your guys' network and what you're trying to create, which is cool. And I think, there's a place for just, hey, I just need capital and I get that from a founder standpoint. And yeah, the best investors are the ones that are kind of hard nosed and like they challenge and push and also are very patient and understanding. And that is a very tough blend for a human to have, especially when there's a lot of money on the line, which is a very challenging thing for people to think about. So yeah, right. Thanks for expanding on that. I think it's a cool thing people are wrestling with. All right, everyone, I want to take a quick break from today's episode and just share a little bit about Impact Foundation, who's got an incredibly awesome model of using impact investment, charitable dollars, and funding tons of projects all over the world right now. What if your investments could change the world? At Impact Foundation, they believe business with purpose has the power to transform society. Purpose-built for impact investing, Impact Foundation provides a streamlined way to fund businesses that seek social and spiritual transformation or make loans to charity, all while earning a financial return to grow your giving. Donors and investors have already supported more than 200 redemptive enterprises through their impact accounts. They provide needed fuel for companies that exist as a force of God's redemptive work in the world. To learn more about what they're doing in their Kingdom Impact Investing model, visit impactfoundation.org. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about as we kind of close out here a little bit is you and I have talked about the debt versus equity thing quite a bit. You've seen deals come into the picture and thrown them my way and say, hey, maybe you could help these guys, or hey, do you know anyone for this? I've had deals that we've seen, I've thrown them your way and say, hey, this is fit for the network. And one of the things you and I always what we realized over time was, if it's debt versus an equity, what's going to happen, and wrestling with how do we do that? And so I'm kind of curious. I won't give my opinion yet because I've given it on the podcast quite a bit, but where have you guys landed on debt versus equity, and what are some of your thoughts on it? And when we say this, I mean, I'm talking, I guess, just to give people like guardrails here. Like, there are some entities where they decide in their investment offering that giving away equity and having that kind of relationship, there might not even be an exit strategy in the future. Like, it's just not a fruitful way to go about it. So they choose debt. And then there's some that, hey, there is an exit strategy and that's kind of worth it. And investors and different networks and stuff fall across the board on that kind of thing. So yeah. Give me your thoughts on all that. Can of worms.
Totally. And I think one more other piece of context for folks who might not be as familiar with kind of investment vehicles is generally in a debt offering, you're going to get, it's like a loan. So you're going to get the principal plus some sort of interest. And that interest these days is going up as, rates go up and as inflation rises. But it's generally something in the high single digits, or like between like 8 and 12% usually. Yep. Whereas on an equity check, as we were talking about previously, you can have returns that are in the 50 to 100x if you're on a unicorn. So financially speaking, totally, equity offerings tend to be more potential upside. And so a lot of the conversation, as you pointed out, has been like, well, if I'm not going to have an exit, or it doesn't really make sense for me to sell the business someday, if this is just a long-term strategy, then maybe I'll just do debt because my investors don't really have a liquidity option eventually anyways. And I think what we found, at least from our perspective at Potomac, is that for our investors, when they think about risk, especially early stage risk, if we're talking about two ventures that have equal risk and one is offering debt and one is offering equity, and we can talk about the impact profiles of those two companies. Yeah. If you're doing the math as an investor, you're going, man, why wouldn't I go with the equity check that can produce 50 to 100x maybe, if I'm taking the same risk as what's going to give me 8% a year. Totally. And so for them, it becomes really hard to get their minds around debt. I also think if you think of it in a broader portfolio strategy, so we probably don't have time to get into this a ton, but when you think about venture capital, if we say that 60% 6 out of 10 deals are going to go to zero. 1 or 2 are going to return capital. 1 or 2 are going to be, one's going to be 5 to 10, and then hopefully you get one that's 25x plus to really round out that portfolio and make that math work. It becomes really hard statistically thinking over time to invest in one that might be debt, because even if you make it back, that's your like one that's like 1 to 2x, and it's carrying the same risk as the others. So I'm not sure if I explained that well, given the fact that we don't have like a chart.
I think you explained that perfectly. Yeah. Like that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think it's, so from wearing that hat, like from your lens, that makes perfect sense. For me, when I've sat with someone who is looking to have impact and they're willingly, we'll go with the organization that is hiring women out of incarceration, and 30-40% of their time is going to be maybe addiction therapy or reentry stuff. And so like they're operating at a loss. And so they're going to be fiscally self-sustainable maybe, but they're always going to have to fundraise a portion, whatever. And so you get like capital campaigns. And so if you look at it, like the organization could do traditional philanthropy, but they're like, hey, we could actually be pretty fiscally self-sustainable, pay back a debt. They're actually moving pretty well. Like we want nonprofit organizations to move into that space.
Sure.
The challenge is then, where does that capital sit? Because we've got philanthropic capital and we've got in equity capital, like you were talking about. But we want to encourage organizations to move from the philanthropic into this weird middle ground. But the weird middle ground doesn't really have an investor capital community associated with it. And that's where I think Impact Foundation and that movement has done a really good job of like, okay, philanthropic charitable capital used for that purpose is really good. And I think it makes nonprofits think more about fiscal self-sustainability and like high performance and functioning like a business and stuff. And so it's tough because there's times where I'm like, man, this just isn't a good fit. I also know that there's organizations that need capital that, like you said, are never going to sell. And so it's like, okay, well, how do we do this? And if they're not going to sell, if there's not that exit strategy, there's an upside. What I hope to see happen in some ways is that individual investors start to look at their own portfolio from a spiritual standpoint and carve out slices for everything. So they've got a slice they carve out philanthropically. They've got a slice they carve out for the traditional market. It might be their 401k. They've got a slice they carve out for venture capital, those deals, like you were just saying, that 6 out of 10 and 1 to 2 and the 25x. And then they say, well, okay, there is this middle weird ground that we can do something in with debt, and they plug it in there because as an overall fund where you need to return the investor money and do all that stuff, that doesn't really, like you were saying, the math doesn't work. As an individual, I can say I'm okay with the math not working because I feel called spiritually to do that. And so that's the shift that I hope happens as people start to, and I think we're already seeing that. We're seeing people do that with their donor advised funds and charitable capital. I think that the difference is like adding a category of non-charitable capital impact investing, and the impact bucket then breaks into high risk debt and then the other one. And so, it's a pie chart. And I think that's happening. But I think there needs to be like what I appreciate with you guys is the conviction on it. Cause I don't want people to say, yeah, we're open to debt. We're open to this. We're open to pretty much anything, but then they're really not. And it never passes their due diligence. Like you guys are saying, hey, for our network, this is a good fit. And other people are saying, hey, we're open to debt. We're going to do this. I think Tom and Greg Lernahan, who've been on the podcast, they're really great at, with his fund. They're great with some debt options and have done some things, but they've got two separate buckets of how they do things. Then it's really cool. So it's an interesting conversation that's definitely moving and growing and a tough one at the same time.
Totally. Yeah. And I think you kind of nailed it. That in middle area where I've seen it work really well is when it's using charitable capital. So when people feel like through Impact Foundation, which obviously shout out to them because they've done some amazing work through Impact Foundation, you can take this charitable capital and use it in a for-profit way that might actually return that capital. And then we can bless other people or bless more nonprofits or reinvest. Like that makes it a lot easier to kind of carve out that middle gray area. The other thing that I've heard from my investors is as we've talked about mutuality and like being in relationship with, like signing a loan document, promissory note makes them, one of my mentors and investors who I'm actually going to go see here in about an hour says, it makes me feel like I'm the bank and not a partner. And so from a personal perspective, it can be really hard. And so one of the things I've been working on, we haven't done this yet, but I'll throw this out there. And I know me and you have talked about this a little bit. One of the things I've been thinking about is like, what are some other structures that could bring more of a middle ground where we haven't done a deal like this yet, or I haven't convinced one of these sort of middle ground, high impact, low financial gain companies to do this yet. But I've been talking a lot with them about revenue shares or guaranteed distributions.
Yeah.
What that does, it's just,
we've tried that too.
Yeah. It keeps the investor as a partner in the business, really feels like they're still involved and like their money is meaningful, and gives them some long-term upside if this thing ends up running. But also provides the capital in a really sustainable way for the business. Now, obviously a couple of businesses we've worked on have been pretty low margin. There's not a lot of room to like cut in investors on profits, but even still, it just feels like a different conversation.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that will catch fire at all.
Yeah. It's funny, as I've run, because we've run some financial models on that with clients, and two things happen. One is it just starts to look like you're paying down a loan, because you look at the first 3 to 7 years and you're like, okay, when have they gotten their principal back? And when have they gotten X% back? And generally, if we're looking at this kind of model in that low return, it's generally for the amount of capital, it's like a 4 to 7 year time frame. And to get just back your principal plus a little bit of interest, it's really got to be, okay, this is a long-term 10 to 20 years. I want profits to come out of this thing. And you're looking at it, which is a good investment. But a lot of the angel world is saying, hey, I really want something that's like 2 to 5 years, going to blow up, be this. And so it's hard to match both those things, but it's better than debt. But I feel like whenever I explain it, I put it in there, I feel like I'm just building a debt model anyways. The other flip side of that too is there's a lot of risk, because the chances of that founder sticking around for like I get my upside, year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, that's the upside there. And so there's risk for the investor to say, is that founder going to stick around? Are they going to have a leadership change? What if they do sell and I don't have a high percentage of equity because we didn't want my annual draw, so the contract has to be bulletproof, where it's like, okay, well, if you sell, I'm a first paid investor, it's so all of a sudden now you're looking at this investment offering, trying to put it on one slide of a PowerPoint. I'm like, I can't get all the details in here. And then the final piece, and this is selfish of the founder, sometimes is you start to look at, okay, let's say things do go well. And you look at the upside for the investor and you're like, oh man, like if this goes well at what we're saying and they're getting the revenue share, then we're giving a lot of money to investors. Like they're getting a huge return. Now, when you sell a business and you walk away from it, that's great. But when they're thinking, okay, in year 10, I'm grinding day to day, the capital they gave me 10 years ago is pretty far in the background. That was helpful, but they're getting like, a massive chunk. How do you do that? And so we've talked about like, okay, do they get, once the business is at a 20% net profit margin per year, meaning they have enough capital to like have a buffer and function, then they start paying 50% of leftover profits back to them until the principal plus 10% is back. And then after that point, it drops to where they're just getting an annual dividend of like 10% or something to kind of protect that. Now, even just how I said that is like making my head spin. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm saying with all that, and I hope people are hearing like, oh, okay, I hope this is getting people noodling on it. I love the idea of it. It's finding an investor and a founder who like that perfectly works with them. And usually what I've seen is by the end of the capital raise, they're like, screw it, we're just going to do equity, or all right, we're just going to do debt. Like they just go to one or the other and figure it out.
Look, I think I do, this space is still pretty new. We're still trying to figure out how to handle that middle ground, how to communicate it, how to bring people alongside.
Yep.
And I think, so me and you are kind of on the forefront of some of those discussions, at least internally, since we think about this all day long. I do think this might be a growth area for the space. Like, how do we think about revenue shares or guaranteed distributions, especially as investors mature and as entrepreneurs mature and are thinking about this? But as you said, there's no like clear answer, and there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts on both sides of that equation. I just think it's something that we should consider, and I think we should probably, as you said, like I really want to find an entrepreneur and an investor who are willing to try it. Because then we're going to learn a ton. Like if you go try this, We'll see how it works. It might be a disaster. 100%. It might be a huge win. Like, we don't really know. We kind of need to try it. So it's almost entrepreneurial in nature that we're like, this is what we're thinking about. But I think it just shows like that people, like we are as people who are interested in this, investors, entrepreneurs, folks like us who like build those ecosystems or support on some side, we're really interested on how can we get businesses funded that are going to have this sort of huge, high impact, low financial gain strategy.
Yep.
Or maybe it's not, maybe it's high financial gain, but just no liquidity. Like, how do we get capital in those places? Because if we can get capital there, then that impact is what we're looking for and what we want to do with our money and our time. And so it's like, it just shows that people are concerned or excited or just like passionate about this space. And so I think we need to have more conversations like this, because we'll have to figure it out together over the next few years for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the desire for a higher level of impact, we've talked about what that means differently, but the desire for that is opening the door for people to take different risks in that space. It's not just all about money. And so I think we're presented with more opportunities for that, and people are more open to more risky, crazy, weird things because they're saying, yeah, it's more risky and crazy, but if it works, it's not just that I'm going to make this return, but this impact is going to happen in the community. And I think that's a really cool way that door is opening, which is awesome. Well, dude, this is always fun. These are always great conversations, and we could probably wrestle on this stuff for a while. We'll have to do another one of these in a year and say, hey, did we do one of these deals? Or maybe we'll do one of those deals. We'll structure one and then we'll just do a podcast episode about it. But yeah, man, thanks for being on. Thanks for the work you guys are doing. I love it. I'm stoked about it. And hope to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, Ryan, I appreciate the work you're doing with entrepreneurs. I think is essential to getting folks ready for my angel groups like mine, funds who are super appreciative of helping prepare these opportunities in a way that communicates to investors their value and their mission and impact, and just appreciate what you've been doing for organizations that are changing the world. So thanks for having me on. And yes, I think we probably have another list of like 5 or 10 things we could riff on. So let's get back in a year and choose some different topics and have another go at it.
Yeah, man. Totally. Cool. Well, thanks for being on, man. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to another week of the Feast Over Famine podcast. We are so thankful you guys are here and listening. As always, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening apps. We would love to keep you guys up to date on new episodes that are coming out, when we're launching new episodes, when we're launching new seasons, and everything in between. So when we're in season, episodes are dropping every single Wednesday. Hit that subscribe button. Make sure you're up to date. Also, if you're loving what we're doing, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, where we're constantly posting about our projects, what they're doing, what kinds of things we're working on. We'll recycle some podcasts, things about our partners, all sorts of fun stuff that you want to see. So hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff, and check out what we're doing there. And yeah, we're stoked that you guys are listening. We hope this has been really fruitful, and we will catch you guys next week. And lastly, as you guys all know, we always talk about all sorts of things with impact investing, investment opportunities, entity structure modeling, how projects are getting capital. And as a disclaimer and a reminder, Feast Over Famine does not provide legal, tax, accounting, or other professional advice. You should consult professional advisors concerning the legal, tax, or accounting consequences of any activities related to your project or a project you're supporting. Feast Over Famine doesn't consult, advise, or assist with the offer or sale of securities in any capital raising transaction. We don't do that for the direct or indirect promotion or maintenance of a market for any securities. And Feast Over Famine does not engage in any activities for which an investment advisor's registration or license is required under the U.S. Investment Advisors Act of 1940 or under any other applicable federal or state law, or for which a broker's or dealer's registration or license is required under the U.S. Securities Exchange Act of 1934 or under any other applicable federal or state law. So there's your investment disclaimer. Hopefully that's helpful if you need it. And if you ever have any questions on that side of things, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Take care.